Okay, this is page 305, chapter 12, Nationalism in the 19th Century. So first off, nationalism, this is an idea or a trend that appears after the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. During that time period of the early 1800s, the landscape of Europe, the borders of all these nations starts to be redrawn because there's so many wars going on. With that being said, it actually strengthened a lot of Europeans' sense of national identity, like this is my group of people. We are united by a similar history or a culture or a language. Outcomes of nationalism outside of music would be the unification of lands, such as Germany and Italy, the promotion of using native languages rather than just the conquering nation, and an enthusiasm for old folk songs, dances, legends, whatever, anything that was, this is our culture. Now with nationalism, it is important to say that although this does bring a sense of unity, it also can bring about a sense of exclusion. We are including these people, but we are excluding these people. Nationalism, when we're thinking about historically, can get tricky. But we are looking at nationalism in music. So composers trying to bring about a feeling of nationalism, they would use folk songs and dances and melodies. Now, just from that's like nothing different has happened. People have been using folk songs and music for hundreds of years. We've seen this. But there tends to be an increase in that trend. People start to use legends, history, or even the landscape as points of inspiration for music, particularly in opera or program music. The title of a work could emphasize a nation of origin, such as Rimsky-Korsakov's Russian Easter Overture or Sibelius' his Finlandia. And music starts to sound different depending on where the nation of origin is. So if a composer is from France, French music will sound different from German music. There was actually a big musical rivalry between those two countries, as well as a political rivalry. Either way, as these different regions start to develop their own musical language, these different styles actually let you hear different nations. So that's something that's interesting if we take apart or pick apart music here in Western Europe. Sometimes nationalist music takes political undertones because nationalism had become political. So for a good musical example, you have the composer Giuseppe Verdi, pictured here. He would choose the libretti, or the words, the text to his operas that would subtly speak out against Austrian rule in Italy. At this time, Austria had overtaken parts of Italy, and so Verdi, being an Italian nationalist, he wanted to advocate that Italy belonged to the Italians and not the Austrians. Nationalism was really important and felt more strongly in countries whose own musical heritage may have been overshadowed by the countries or the music heritage of larger countries. So the large countries at this point would have been France, Germany, Austria. So there's a lot of French and German influence. Smaller countries would have been Poland, Russia, Bohemia, Scandinavian countries, and Spain. And when we're talking about small countries versus big countries, we don't mean geographically. We're talking about a strong musical history or lineage versus ones that had been overshadowed for so long. So if you turn the page, look on page 306, starting to talk about Russian musical nationalism. So this starts to pick up in the 1800s, here in the middle of the 1800s. Russia in general had a strong folk song influence in everyday life. So people were very much familiar with their own folk material. Prior to the 1800s, the art music within Russia was not written by Russians. They had composers come in from France, Italy, Germany, the big countries, the big historically strong musical cultures. The first major Russian composer would be Mikhail Glinka, lived from 1804, died in 1857. Out of this nationalist trend in Russia, you get this group called the Russian Five, so 5 different composers, and they started to write nationalist music in the 1860s. They had a nationalist school. Now, this is not an actual physical school with a building and teachers. It's more of a school of thought, so it's like a club, more or less. These people would give criticism for each other's work, so like helpful criticism, like, oh, I think you could do this better, constructive criticism. And they wanted to break from any German, Italian, and French traditions while bolstering or vamping up Russian traditions. So why do they want to do this? Well, remember that France, Italy, Germany, the Germanic area here, all of that is in what we call Western Europe, which is where we've been studying for a lot of this this course. Here's Russia all the way over here. They're very far removed, and they don't feel connected to Western Europe all the time. And so these composers wanted music that sounded like their own region. And just to give you a scope here, here is Eastern Europe, here is Russia. Remember that Russia is absolutely gigantic. So the Russian Five, who are these people? You have Balakirev, Cuy, Borodin, Rimsky-Korsakov, and Mussorgsky. All of them were in the 1800s. They were focused or centralized in St. Petersburg. And we're going to look at Mussorgsky. He lived from 1839, died in 1881. His name is not modest, it's modest. But he was a son of a wealthy landowner. He actually had a small military career. He became an officer at 17, but soon after he left so that he quit that career so that he could be a composer. He found a job as a government clerk in St. Petersburg after the emancipation of the Russian serfs in 1861. Being a wealthy landowner after the serf emancipation didn't work out, so he had to get a job. But his participation with the Russian Five, he had no formal training in composition. Actually, the only one of those 5 gentlemen, Balakirev, he was the only one who was a trained musician. Everyone else was kind of taught by themselves. He did have some psychological issues that led to alcoholism and eventually his death, which is really sad. He did not write a lot of music because he died so young, but his very famous works would be Night on Bald Mountain, the opera of Boris Godunov, and what we're going to take a look at, the Pictures at an Exhibition, which is a piano cycle. Night on Bald Mountain is an orchestral piece. So, Pictures at an Exhibition, what Mussorgsky wrote, is a cycle of different piano pieces, and each piece was inspired by a painting at the memorial exhibition of Mussorgsky's friend. So the friend had died, someone had made an exhibition of this guy's paintings, and Mussorgsky, going to this, was inspired to write a cycle of piano pieces. There are 10 pieces in total. Other than the introduction, which is called the Promenade, every work relates to a specific painting from the exposition. The Promenade theme will be quoted throughout and will kind of give you an idea as to the composer's thoughts as he goes through this exhibition. This was not performed during Mussorgsky's lifetime, but several years later, about 50 years later, the French composer Maurice Ravel actually took this cycle of piano works and arranged it to be played by orchestra. And a lot of people prefer the orchestral version. What you are going to look at is one of those pieces, the orchestral version arranged by Ravel, and it's called The Great Gate of Kiev. All right, next chapter, this is page 309. Oh, sorry, before I go on. You have a listening guide for The Great Gate of Kiev on page 308. Okay, next chapter, page 309, looking at Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky. Lived from 1840, died in 1893, and he is probably without a doubt the most famous Russian composer. Everybody knows of Tchaikovsky. Interestingly enough, we have a lot of composers who you see start to become interested in music at a very young age. We did not see that with Mussorgsky, and we don't see that here with Tchaikovsky. He didn't start studying music until he was 21 years old. He was working in St. Petersburg. The St. Petersburg Conservatory just opened up, and so he started taking classes. And he quit his job after a year of classes. He wanted to continue as a musician. But he was so good at music that after he graduated, he became a professor of harmony at the Moscow Conservatory, and he held that position for 12 years. And his first great orchestral work is Romeo and Juliet, and we'll take a look at a portion of Romeo and Juliet. So 1877, this was a very rocky time period for Tchaikovsky. First of all, he was gay, and at this point in history, it was illegal to be gay. So to hide the fact that he had a sexual preference other than the norm, he actually married a woman that he met at the conservatory. They were happy for about 2 weeks, and then he just decided he could not do this anymore. He attempted suicide and then had a nervous collapse. Afterwards, he and his wife split. So very sad there. However, around that same time, things started picking up in another area of his life. He acquired a wealthy benefactress, Nadezhda von Meck, and they became great friends. And she actually gave him an annuity, so gave him basically an allowance every so often to keep him afloat, keep him working, and he was actually able to quit his job at the Moscow Conservatory because of that. They never met in person. They would only talk through letters, so they were kind of like really great pen pals. However, just one day out of the blue, after 14 years of friendship, she just cut him off. No more money, no more letters, nothing. No one really understands why she decided to basically friend dump Tchaikovsky. But looking at Tchaikovsky's music here, his style, even though he's a Russian composer, and he does have some nationalist tendencies, he was still influenced by French, Italian, and German music. So he is not part of the Russian Five, he is just a Russian composer. So he blends some Russian qualities with a lot of Western European traditions. Some famous works would be Romeo and Juliet, which we'll look at in just a second, the ballet The Nutcracker, very likely you have seen this around Christmas time, and two other ballets, Swan Lake and Sleeping Beauty. If you start to think about Disney's Sleeping Beauty when I said that, you were absolutely correct because Disney used some of Tchaikovsky's music in that film, so you probably know Sleeping Beauty music as well. Okay, Romeo and Juliet. This was written in 1869, so we've already said that Shakespeare had a huge influence on Romantic composers. Tchaikovsky was not an exception. He loved Shakespeare as well, and he actually composed this overture at age 29. It's technically an overture fantasy, or that's what Tchaikovsky calls it. Originally, this was a flop, which is kind of sad. Its premiere, people just didn't like it, they didn't get it, so he revised it, but it did not pick up in popularity until about 20 years later, after he had already established his career. However, because this is program music, it's going to focus on the emotions of the play, but it's not going to give you like a point-by-point demonstration of the characters or the plot. It's not trying to do that. Again, program music is trying to express emotion. Okay, and you have Romeo and Juliet in your playlist, and you also have the Great Gate of Kiev in your playlist. I forgot to say that. But the listening guide for this piece is on page 311. And we'll stop there for right now.